The Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy epic has stood the test of time, encapsulating the minds of readers across the globe with its fantastical creatures, dynamic landscapes, and entrancing plot. Later on in 2001, Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring jump-started the award-winning trilogy we know today, and brought moviegoers into Tolkien's fold. And it was through these movies that I was introduced to Lord of the Rings, and that's what led me to pick up this, Inside Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I'd never heard of it before, so I was completely enamored by it. So I picked it up and took it home and did some research. Inside Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was published by Culture International Video in 2003, and many of the production staff on the DVD actually show their commentary on the disc, like the writer Robert DiNapoli, but most strangely is the director behind it, Chris Gormile. He wasn't in the DVD, and also I couldn't find much information on him online, let alone a picture. And I was also pleasantly surprised to find out that the narrator is Graham McTavish, and you may not know his name, but he played one of the dwarves in the Hobbit trilogy, Dwalin to be specific. And that makes me wonder if he got that Hobbit role through this production, but I don't know for sure. More recently, he played King Atlan in 2018's Aquaman movie, and he played Dracula in Netflix's Castlevania series. What's a narrator without anything to narrate over? Well, actually, the entire commentary was imagined by the brothers Hildebrandt, Greg and Tim, a duo of brother painters who have been imagining Tolkien's work for years and years and years, like way since before I was born. In between these paintings is the commentary of many esteemed guests. They have historians, biographers, Tolkien's own children, John and Priscilla Tolkien. Now, there were two things that really puzzled me about this. First thing was on the back of the disc, because it says, the DVD has not been prepared, authorized, licensed, blah blah blah, or endorsed by Tolkien's heirs or estate, or by any of the publishers or distributors of the book, or with the producers of the movie. I just thought that was a funny nod. You could tell it's going to be good. But then also, they don't acknowledge the movies whatsoever, or at least in the first disc of this. And that's strange because this came out in 2003, whereas the first movie came out in 2001. Whatever that reason may be for not including them, production delays, release delays, just reluctance to include them whatsoever, the book-only perspective really intrigued me. So that's what I'll be mainly focusing on this video. I'll be comparing my movie-centric views with those of the documentary that were based in a time when the movies probably didn't even exist. Also note that I'm only going to be covering the first episode over the Fellowship of the Ring, because just this episode alone is over an hour long, and that's already a lot to cover. There's three main topics that I'm going to be going over, and you'll learn those throughout the rest of this video. And with that being said, let's look inside Tolkien's Lord of the Rings.
Throughout the trilogy, Tolkien employs a repeated pattern of action. First, a character makes a mistake, which directly produces a dangerous situation. These situations are then resolved by unlooked-for help and are followed always by an interlude of safety, rest and comfort, usually during which counsel is taken.
Now, as you probably guessed by now, this plot pattern that they just introduced in that segment, that's the first of the three topics I mentioned earlier. I never noticed it in the movies, but now that they bring it up, I can totally see it working in the scope of the films. But the example that they use to explain this plot pattern doesn't happen in the movies.
And it occurs first in the Shire, where Frodo delays setting off on the journey.
In the books, he takes over 13 years to leave to go on this journey finally, and that's what he's mentioning when he says it takes him a long time and delays his journey. But then in the movies, it's almost moments after he finds out about the ring that he starts and heads off to his journey to Rivendell.
This leads to the dangerous situation with the Black Riders.
In both mediums, the danger is just the same. In both the book and the movies, The Black Riders catch up to Frodo as he's leaving on his journey.
The hobbits then receive unexpected help from a party of elves led by Gildor.
These elves that help Frodo don't even show up in the movies. They're a big deal in the books, obviously, because they're the ones who save him from the Black Riders. But in the movies, Frodo doesn't get help from the Riders till much later on, not even in this topic. The characters aren't even there in the movies, but they are in the books.
And they take advice from them.
And I don't even really need to mention this one, but obviously since we know the elves don't show up in the movies whatsoever, it's impossible to take the counsel with them that he mentions here. And although this specific example doesn't happen in the movies, it isn't much later on until we see the first full cycle of this appear in the movies. After recruiting the help of the Ranger Strider and still fleeing from the Nazgul, the hobbits take shelter on the abandoned outpost of Weathertop. As Strider leaves to gather supplies, the hobbits light a fire to cook up some food. This is the mistake, the first part of the pattern. The Nazgul see the smoke and quickly approach the outpost. Now this leads to the danger. The help comes when Strider unexpectedly comes back from his search and saves them, and then he tries to tend to Frodo's wounds as best as possible. That's the safe counsel. On the topic of repeating patterns, there's this trippy live-action sequence that they keep cutting back to in the documentary, and it has this weird storybook effect, and I don't know, I just think it's really charming. It reminds me of an old, Elder Scrolls game loading screen if you've ever played those. Now this pattern that Tolkien makes, the cycle between making mistakes to danger to unexpected help to safe counsel, it happens again, but not to the same degree. Characters still make mistakes and they still face danger because of it, but it's the unexpected help and safe counsel parts start to veer off track. The whole point of the first book and movie is to set up this Fellowship of the Ring, this group of 9 companions tasked with destroying the Ring of Power, and it's the essence of this fellowship that destroys this pattern. Being a band of brothers, they're supposed to be there for each other. They don't need that unexpected help, which is that third integral step of the pattern. This was definitely a purposeful choice for the filmmakers because they've emphasized more of the camaraderie between the characters rather than throwing in some random Deus Ex Machina to come in and save them. They also don't counsel with their unexpected help because it doesn't exist. Instead, the Fellowship hones their battle skills, they grow stronger bonds. In a way, I guess that expresses their safe counsel. So though this pattern in the documentary doesn't retain the exact same qualities in the movie, it definitely influenced Peter Jackson and the other filmmakers while they were remaking them.
Into the clearing comes an extraordinary figure, short, stocky and bearded, in yellow boots and a blue coat. With amiable nonchalance, he introduces himself as Tom Bombadil.
Now, Tom Bombadil is a really big anomaly when compared to the rest of Fellowship of the Ring. First and most obviously, he's not in the movies whatsoever. He's just not included. And even though he's never mentioned, he's never shown, the hobbits are in his company for 2 chapters in the book, so he's obviously a major part of the book, but he's never in the movies. When I first read the book, and note that I'd already seen the movies at this point, Tom's entrance didn't make any sense whatsoever. It didn't feel right, it didn't fit in, it just didn't feel the same when compared to the rest of the book. Tolkien sets the scene of this Ent named Old Man Willow, trapping the hobbits under its roots, picking them up with his branches, and though Ents are introduced in the movies later on, this is where the ridiculousness starts. Then in comes Tom Bombadil, skipping in and whispering to Old Man Willow and telling him to free the hobbits, and then he does. This whole series of events seems like something out of a children's fairy tale, not a more grounded fantasy like Lord of the Rings. But strangely enough, the documentarians actually agree with that.
Tom Bombadil doesn't completely fit into the rest of the Fellowship of the Ring very comfortably. He's a strange anomaly, really.
But then later on they do state why his inclusion makes sense and helps add on to the book.
Tom Bombadil, it's in a sense what you're getting in those early chapters of The Lord of the Rings is moving away from this cosy Shire, which is almost, the children's story type of thing, and you're moving into a much deeper and darker world and much more grim heroic legend type of world. And in a sense, Tom Bombadil is a mediating character.
They argue that Tom Bombadil is a living oxymoron, being purposefully different from the rest of the book to help differentiate it from that old type of fantasy and explain that Lord of the Rings will not be that childlike sort of fantasy. And though this idea makes sense, it really only makes sense on paper. When you try to put it in film, it doesn't make sense. In cinema, it's all about pacing. Don't go too slow, don't go too fast. It's okay to go off topic as long as you don't digress too much, unless your entire movie is about going off topic, but I digress. Including Tom breaks all these rules. It slows the pacing, it breaks the tension of the Nazgul pursuit, and it also breaks the movie's established pacing, which is there's danger one step behind and it's always following. And if they stayed at Tom Bombadil's house for a few days singing and eating food, that just wouldn't make sense. But let's say the filmmakers found the perfect way to include him. No pacing issues, no issues whatsoever. Even in that perfect world, it's still not a good idea to include Tom Bombadil. His place as a reminder of what fantasy once was, and showing that the rest of the story is going to be different, it isn't that easy of a topic for the average moviegoer to grasp. In a novel, you have more time to explain your choices, and you don't have that time in a movie, and doing those choices without any explanation will just confuse the watchers. So the filmmakers were 100% correct not to include him. He's far too different or complex to include in the movie, and so, in that way, the documentarians are right. They knew he was different, they knew he didn't fit in the story. They only explain his inclusion because he's always been in Lord of the Rings. Every type of Lord of the Rings media up at that point, Tom Bombadil's been in every single one of them, so they have no reason to discuss removing him if they're so comfortable with him being there. But now that the movies do exist and Tom isn't present, it makes total sense to not include him.
As they negotiate the difficult terrain, drawing nearer to Rivendell, they are met by the Elf Lord, Glorfindel, who has been dispatched to search for the Ring-Bearer and help him to reach Elrond's sanctuary.
With every book-to-movie adaptation, we have this discussion of characters that were altered or removed from the book to the movie adaptation. And with characters like Tom I mentioned earlier, these characters' removals have very specific reasons behind them. Tom broke continuity and confuses the audience, and with the character of Glorfindel, he has his own reasons. Remember that segment I was talking about earlier when the hobbits were attacked by the Nazgul and Weathertop? Well, during this attack, Frodo was actually stabbed by one of the Nazgul, and it left him really infected and sick, and he needed medicine fast. Strider tried his best to heal Frodo, but it was only temporary, and he needed better medicine. In comes Glorfindel, an elven general from Rivendell, who had heard word of Frodo's arrival and was sent to retrieve him. He takes Frodo upon his horse, and they ride away from the Nazgul. As they cross a river, the Nazgul are flooded away by this huge wave that is created by the Elf Lord Elrond. They eventually make their way to Rivendell, but Glorfindel is never heard from again after this encounter. Though they never explicitly say it, you can tell that the documentarians don't think Glorfindel is that important. They don't even have any drawings of him in the background. And his removal from the movies emphasizes that unimportance. But he's not removed and an empty void is left. He's actually replaced by the elven princess Arwen. Now let's look back into a few reasons why this exchange makes a lot of sense. If you remember, Frodo took 13 years to originally leave on his journey, which gave Glorfindel and Elrond ample time to learn of his arrival and prepare for it. In the movie, it's only hours and then he leaves, giving the elves no time to hear of it. But the difference is, Arwen has a romantic connection to Strider, so this romantic connection to one of the main characters involved explains her hasty involvement. We already explained that the elves don't know Frodo is coming because of the lack of time, so this huge wave conjured by Elrond doesn't make sense either. That's why in the movies, it's Arwen, daughter of Elrond and likely to have the same powers, who conjures the wave. But there also comes the issue of representation. In the Lord of the Rings book, there's only one prominent female character, and that is the elven witch Galadriel. The documentarians comment on this, thinking it's sufficient to only have one female character. But in today's society, that's just meeting the status quo. Movies should more accurately represent the audience watching them, and replacing Glorfindel with Arwen improves that. And lastly, Arwen actually sticks around. Unlike Glorfindel, who swoops in, saves the hobbits once, and is never heard from again, Arwen actually goes to fight alongside her friends, become a queen, and have further involvement in the story. Arwen becomes a character that the audience actually cares about, which would be impossible with the shallow husk of Glorfindel. I actually think this is the one topic I disagree with the documentarians. Just like Tom, every single Lord of the Rings media has had Glorfindel in it, so there's no reason to explain why he wouldn't be there, and so they deliberate on him, shallow as he is. But in the movies, replacing him with Arwen is the best decision the filmmakers made. Now there's a lot more to these documentaries, but those were the three main topics I wanted to cover. Lord of the Rings has obviously had a resurgence since the making of these documentaries, with the previously mentioned Jackson trilogy, the Hobbit prequels, scores of games, and a new Amazon Prime TV show on the way, which I'm really excited about. With that resurgence on the horizon, I like to look back and see the love for the series before it was the multi-million-dollar franchise it is today. These documentaries were a product of passion, with every interlude to the map, with every whimsical art piece, with every, albeit a bit poorly designed, set piece. The love for Tolkien's work oozes out of every aspect.